Welcome everybody. Welcome to the book launch of the book Political Entrepreneurship by Josef Lentsch. This is a book launch organized by the Republican Institute. I'd like to ask our Director of Strategy, Csaba Tóth, to be so kind and introduce our guests and the writer of the book.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you all for being here. My name is Csaba Tóth. I'm Director of Strategy of Republican Institute, and I would like, my role here is first to open this event and welcome you all very much, and of course welcome all our participants, but first and foremost the writer of this book, Josef Lentsch, who I will talk a bit about in detail after all the technical details. The technical details are, of course, very, very important. First of all, this event and Republican Institute is supported by the Europe for Citizens initiative of the European Union, which is a very great initiative for supporting wonderful events like this. In order for us to have more events like this, I will kindly ask you to fill in the questionnaires which you will find on your seats or be distributed to you. On these questions, you can indicate how great this event was, or if you have any questions about this event. Without joke, this is really important for us so that we can continue this work. And third and foremost, we are streaming this event, so if any of you wants to share it on his or her Facebook page, you can do that via the Republican Facebook page. So that was all the technical details, and now we can actually start. Thank you so much again for being here, and Josef, thank you for coming. For those of you who did not have a chance to look at the letter of invitation thoroughly, this is a very important event for us, also for me personally. I have had the honor of sitting at the board of the European Liberal Forum for 2 years with Josef, and we got to know each other very well. And while I was doing other things, he wrote a book at this time. So while I just attended meetings and had great discussions on the future of the European liberalism, he actually wrote a book on interviews on the political startups, and he himself was, and maybe he'll talk about this, a member of first NEOS and then NEOS, an Austrian political startup. When I started working with him, and of course I did know some about politics, but when you think about, and sorry for saying this, Josef, you think about innovation, exciting new ideas, colorful, youthful political parties, Austria is not necessarily the first country that comes into your mind when discussing those. But in fact, it is from Austria that NEOS, which was an inspiration to many other parties, arose in Europe, and which showed a different party model, a party model on political entrepreneurship, on how centrist political startup can challenge the dominant discourse, let that come from the right, let it come from the left, on populism. So he wrote this book, and even then, back then, he's now not the board member of ELF anymore. He does his own thing and his own think tank, but we thought that we would have a book launch here in Budapest. Of course, he's actually doing a book tour, so the book had many launches in many European cities. And the way we thought to have this discussion is to invite two people who are very knowledgeable on the topic from different angles. György Simó, who is, when we think about startups in Hungary, let that be communication or journalism or startups in general is, I think, someone who comes to our mind when we read the book title, Political Entrepreneurship and Startup. How can we connect these two, and who can we invite as an expert? Of course, George immediately came into our minds, who might best be known as the founder of Origo, not the present Origo, but other different Origo. He comes from the startup side, but of course from the political side, we're very happy, Anna, that you could accept this invitation. Anna, of course, represents Momentum as the vice chairperson of Momentum, which is in itself a political startup and which is very strongly featured in this book. And she will be able to give her perspective on the book. We must confess that we initially invited Kapcsán, not because she's, not for any other reason, but because she is featured in the book herself, but she's now part of the Team Europe, and so she's in Brussels, so she will not be joining us today. And we asked Dania Mikats, my colleague, to moderate this event. I am here, I think, in my role as knowing the author and also giving some thoughts in the book. So without further ado, and thanking this, I will give the floor to Josef, and after that I will, of course, Dania will be able to moderate this discussion. But Josef, for those of us who have read little of the book, which is the majority of the audience, the floor is yours. Please present us your book.
Thank you very much, Csaba. Jonapod, good afternoon. I'm actually not too far from here. I'm from Kismarton, and now live in Pécs, of course, in Vienna, and going to Berlin in July. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you, fellow panelists, for taking the time to discuss today with me. As Csaba said, the book is called Political Entrepreneurship. Now that's already a juxtaposition, political and entrepreneurship. How do you put that together? Now, one of my theses in the book is that we actually are witnessing the third wave, as I call it, of entrepreneurship. The first wave, of course, was business entrepreneurship in its purest form itself. But then something happened about 30 years ago that people started to apply some of the tools, some of the methods, the mindset of entrepreneuring something, of trying to achieve something beyond your reach, with resources you don't own, also in the social sphere. So you may know organizations like Ashoka, for example, and others. So suddenly social entrepreneurship was born. The idea that you could use entrepreneurship for social purposes to address social challenges. And I think we are now in the third stage where we can witness some of those people from social entrepreneurship, some of those people directly from business entrepreneurship, going into politics. Those people wouldn't have considered doing this perhaps 10 years ago, and saying we now need to address some really, really political challenges that, you all know that democracy is under threat or even under assault in many places. So we now need to do something about it. And what I'm writing about is centrist political entrepreneurs. Of course, there are very successful political entrepreneurs on the fringes, radicals, populists. Just think about the five-star movement in Italy, think about the AfD in Germany, think about many others that are very successful at disrupting political systems, but not in a good way, but basically really trying to destroy the democratic infrastructure and destroy the united Europe. What I'm writing about are those people who try to reform, who try to innovate and transform the political center, which is, I think, one of the most foremost challenges we are facing at the moment. So I'm not saying that political entrepreneurs are good, morally good by themselves, but basically that it's a mindset and a tool set that you can use to do politics differently. Why I've written a book on it? There hasn't been a lot of literature because it's quite a recent phenomenon. So since 2014, since the last European election, about 100 new parties have been founded in Europe, and some of those have been quite successful. If you think about En Marche, for example, they have now the presidency, they have now the majority in the French Parliament. Of course, they're struggling, but that's quite impressive what they've achieved so far. Progressivna in Slovakia, they have already managed to get the mayor of Bratislava and may by next week have the presidency of Slovakia. And of course there's NEOS, my own party in Austria, which is now in government already on the regional level in Salzburg. We are in a first government. And then there are many other examples, hopefully momentum soon to be in the European Parliament. So I've interviewed those. I've also interviewed Ciudadanos in Spain, who have an election soon and who are now in second or third place and who may also belong to the next Spanish government. So it's quite impressive what those political startups have achieved in such a short amount of time over the last few years. Now, entrepreneurship. As I said, it's a tool set, it's a mindset. It's about achieving objectives with resources that are beyond your current means. You do stuff where other people say that's impossible. You know, people said to us in 2012, it's impossible that you will ever get into the Austrian parliament. It's just too hard. You need too much money, you need too many people, you don't have them, forget about it. But we managed to do so in 18 months, and many others, as I said, have been just as successful or even more successful than we have been. Now the question is, how do you do it? What's the model? And I've interviewed 45 political entrepreneurs on all levels, from chairman, chairwoman to activist, and try to find out, so are there common steps that those political startups take? And in fact there are, and many of those steps are probably quite similar to steps a business startup would take or a social startup would take. So the first step is to really understand the formal and informal rules of the system that you're trying to change. That's easier said than done. That often takes years. It takes years of studying implicitly, not by reading the newspaper, but perhaps by writing stuff, writing blogs, perhaps even writing books, perhaps working in the political periphery in some way. Really understand a deep appreciation, but also understanding of the political system. The second step, once you have developed this deep understanding, of course, it's not just enough to have that understanding, but you need to envision a different politics. What differentiates centrists from populists or from radicals is that, of course, they have a constructive critique of the system. They don't want to throw out the kid with the bathwater. They don't want to destroy the system, but they want to address some challenges the system faces. So you need to come up with a manifesto. You need to come up with some political ideas, some vision, some values that you stand in for. And it's not enough that it's just in your head or it's just on your table in a written manifesto. You need to start involving people. You need to start organizing meetings, and not just in the capital. You need to organize meetings all across the country. For example, NEOS organized quite soon citizen forums across the whole nation. En Marche organized this La Grande Marche, a big data exercise, a listening campaign where they knocked hundreds of thousands of doors across France. Now, once you have this vision and have a shared vision, have a shared set of values, of course, you also need to start building the organization. And this is, I think, where political startups can be most different to established parties. Because if you start from scratch, if you start with a blank sheet of paper, of course, you can design the organization you're running very differently to established parties. For example, my own party, NEOS, decided to be radically transparent. So all the income, all the revenues, and all the expenses are online, live. You can watch them, you can check them. There's no mystery about them. The most transparent party there is. Or another choice that we've made is that we only have one legal entity. There's not a federal party and state parties and local parties. It's just one party. That enables you to do different things, to move quicker, to learn better, perhaps, than other parties, of course, by using technologies as well. And then you need to run. And when you start to build a campaign, it's chaotic. We already talked about that. It's messy, but you need to have some basics in place. One of those basics is you need to know the number that gets you into the parliament. Actually, it's more than one number. And it's not just the voters that you need. It's signatures that you might need, but also it's money that you need in Austria's case, we knew that the number was about 2 million euros. Now that's a lot of money, and many people underestimate how soon they need to start beginning fundraising to actually get close to that number to be competitive. And then, if you're successful, you enter. And actually, entering is like an IPO, probably for a startup. It's of course a moment of ecstasy, really kind of seeing your startup in the parliament. But it's also a moment of trauma, because everyone plans for the day you get in, but nobody has any plans for the day after, right? So you're totally in shock. What are you doing? You know, everyone, the staff are knocking on your doors and says, you know, what about my contract? It has run out yesterday. Do I still have a job? So hundreds of thousands of applications pour in. Everybody wants to work with you. You need to respond. And all those kinds of things. It's absolutely crazy. You make mistakes. There are professionals all around who just wait that you make some kind of stupid thing. And you can talk about that later. Startups make many stupid things. And some of them, because you don't have an established brand, actually may kill you, as in some cases it already has. And most political startups, as I said, fail. Finally, and I'll end with that, of course, it's not enough just to get into parliament. Of course, that's the first step. But ultimately, of course, you want to govern. So you need to, for example, get into state governments. You need to scale on the local level. So that scaling challenge is, of course, a total different challenge to getting in. And again, very, very hard to do quickly. However, again, there are some who have managed to do so. There are some who are still alive and actually are in governments and have already changed the policies of their countries. So this is why I think centrist political startups are not our only hope. I'm not naive. I don't think that they're the saviors of European democracy. I think they're also reformers in existing established parties that need support and need help in lots of parties. But I think political startups can help revive democracies, not just by getting into governments, but by keeping other parties on their toes, and by creating an innovation ecosystem around them, by creating alumni who not stay in politics for their whole lives, but to move on into other systems of society, and who really have this deep appreciation that politics is really something important, that democracy is really something fragile, but also the best idea we've had in probably 2,000 years. So that's it from me so far, and looking forward to the discussion with my fellow panelists and with you. Cheers.
Thank you, Josef, very much. There's a lot of issue you mentioned actually in your introduction, and it's very interesting. But first, I just like to have a basic question about startups, because I think this is actually a format or a technique of not just doing politics, but also doing business. So my first question would be, I don't know if you identify yourself as a startup, I mean, your party, but still my question would be, what do you think, what is the most important added value of the startup format? Or more basically, why are startups better than traditional organizations?
First of all, thank you for being invited, and thank you for making your book be known for us. Because I have to start my answer that actually this book was not written, I think, firstly for the audience to understand what's going on with these new progressive movements and parties, but for us who are making and creating these movements to understand who we are. It made me clear a lot of things, all the stupid mistakes and all the challenges we are facing. It was all mentioned in this book. And also it's really interesting when we started before the Olympia campaign, when we were really an underground, small group of youngsters, we were calling ourselves as a political startup. But we thought it's just our inner joke. We didn't know that actually this phenomenon exists. And the reason why we called ourselves a political startup was because there were a lot of creativity, a lot of people who put their own time and effort to create something without money, without anybody believing that something from a basement made by some youngsters can be big. And actually, just because we were capable and also we were not afraid to dream big, we started with an Olympia campaign, which was, I know, good timing, a good idea, and we were lucky as well. However, I think it's important to state that we were brave enough to not being afraid to jump into that opportunity. I mean, there were 120 members back then. 40 of them lived in abroad. We had absolutely no money, no idea how the press works and what the other is going to react and what's going to result with a campaign that nobody ever tried before. Nobody ever made a local referendum in Budapest because it seems impossible to collect that many signatures in 30 days. To answer to your question, it has its advantages and disadvantages as well. Because we don't have that strict hierarchical structure, although we have rules and regulations and we have different positions and people have different responsibilities. However, at the end of the day, we all do everything, which is crazy. Every day, I'm not just doing representative work, but if it's needed, like yesterday, cleaning up our old basement because we have to move out. And there's no difference between the vice president or an activist. And actually, our most successful periods over the years are always been when nobody cared who has which position, just did it, like the protest wave in December. They were literally, all of us did everything. And this gives an advantage that everybody is right away can be mobilized and ask for whatever to do just because they deeply believe in the case. However, the disadvantage is we all work on a voluntary base. Nobody gets salary. Therefore, everybody has a private life, a professional life, lots of issues. And if the political scene is not that interesting, then of course everybody has something more important to do. To motivate our members and activists. Meanwhile, nothing huge happens. It's really, really difficult. So, like a lot of people asking us why we are not visible enough, why we don't have big events. Is like basically if you work as a political startup, you can cook from the ingredients what you have at the table. You don't have the possibility to go to a political supermarket and just choose the ingredients and then come up with something huge. So it's, for instance, like the easiest example, this protest wave. The media also showed that how much momentum is involved and how much we could mobilize youngsters and how much we took the leading role. Although we had 5 flags and we had really active 40 members. And I saw the other parties' symbols and how much they could bring there and how much they put it in it. And I said, okay, I don't want to calculate how much money they spent on that, but for sure, we used 1% of the whole thing. So you can create a lot of things just because our members are way much more motivated because they're doing everything because they believe in the case and not because we paid for that or not because we can offer something back. However, we always have to somehow figure out how we can pay back. And so far, our recipe was giving them a community. Giving them a sphere where they can meet and talk about public issues, and also a sphere where they can act on those. And it's not a generational thing, but momentum success is deeply rooted, and people finally want to be heard and want to be seen and want to show that they are not afraid. Therefore, we need to always come up with newer and newer ideas what to do at the street. Nobody wants to do politics in an old school way anymore. However, that also gives us a lot of headaches, how to be more and more creative day by day.
Would you continue?
So I think Momentum has had a lot of great ideas and just as everyone else, like for example Neos, also some mistakes were made on the way. So I think it's important that, again, I'm not saying that all the startups will be in government tomorrow. It's a long and rocky road. Just to give you some ideas of perhaps also the mistakes that my party made on the way, communicative mistakes. So, for example, in our case, it was in an hour with the press. Some journalists got us to imply that Neos would be in favor of water privatization. Now, either it doesn't matter if you're a political startup or established party. If you ask for water privatization in Austria, you're dead. we have never had water privatization in our manifesto, but it didn't matter. The media communicated this as such, and for 3 years on the streets, we were asked about water privatization. Administrative mistakes, some of them. As I said, you get applications, you do not respond to them. In the case of Nowoczesna, for example, in Poland, when they asked, when they wrote to the state for their public subsidy, once they got into parliament, there was a number wrong in the account. And they couldn't correct it for legal reasons, so they lost all the public subsidy for 4 years. So those kinds of mistakes, for a startup, they can be lethal. But there are also, of course, some mistakes you don't recognize that quickly, but who haunt you longer. Particularly, of course, recruiting mistakes. So if you put the wrong persons in powerful positions, of course, most of all mandates. If you have someone in a mandate on either level. And then it turns out, actually this is a bad apple. You cannot fire someone who's in a mandate. So how do you deal with those things? Established political parties are robust enough most of the time to actually be able to survive something like that. But if you're a startup, it can be hard. So there are lots of mistakes made on the way, and most political startups fail. But and we talked about that earlier on. I think what political startups ideally can do is be quicker on the feet, and that's one of the advantages to your question. Learn more, learn quicker than the competition. I think that's a competitive advantage. Of course, you need to make use of it, but that starts with technology. That starts with a better organizational design, and then you hopefully grow quicker than the competition. But you have to start small, of course. Not everyone can be en marche.
Should I? Yes, I just can't agree more with the last statement. If you say the word startup, you usually have a lot of value-based connotation in your mind, like fresh guys, young guys, idealist guys. It's an attitude thing. At least that's how you use the phrase in your everyday discussions. To me, it's a little more complex and a little more professional. Startups became a key enterprise form of the 21st century. It's one of the way you do business, or you start a business and build a large enterprise, that is probably the most effective one these days in an environment where technology and media play like a crucial role. So I would like to add a few kind of like dimensions to the discussion. Startups are obviously newcomers to a field, but they have an attitude that they want to grow and build something big. That's by definition a feature of a good startups. If you are a startup and you want to stay small, you want to grow a business which will serve, the local environment, that's not a startup in my vocabulary. So you have to have this ambition. And in order to do that, you actually have a global mindset. In this case, it means you aspire or you attack the largest market you can actually achieve or reach out. Speed is very important. And the most important thing, startups these days are married to technology. And this is probably the most important part. And quite frankly, we discussed this as well earlier, the populist startups of the 21st century are 2 steps ahead of anyone else in the political scenes, as far as I can see it, with embracing technology, using it in their tactics, using it in the dirty tactics. This is what you see in the American election with Trump. But a lesser-known example is the mastermind behind the Movimento 5 Stelle, the Italian movement. There was a guy, a founder, actually the second important guy behind the Grillo, the comedian, who is an internet arch guru. He was married to the idea. He was an enthusiast of the internet back in the 90s. He experienced very early on with forum technologies, bulletin boards, direct discussion, organizing communities via online. And he actually brought that knowledge on a large scale into the whole movement when the Italians started. This kind of conscious technology-driven development is important for every good startup, and we only have seen it earlier with those movements. And probably it will be important for the centrist, more liberal startups as well. That's just one element. And if I can provoke a little bit of a discussion, I've read the book. I really enjoyed it. I think the inspirational part is the most important part of it. It's one of my favorite old ideas to marry or to match entrepreneurship and social cause. And these old aging systems of political systems can actually gain a lot by letting fresh entrepreneur-minded political movements in. But also, if you think of central movements, it seems like we use it in a moral term. Maybe you used the phrase change the system. If you want to change the system, you're hardly in the center. That's by definition, you have to come from the sides, come from the left behinds, come from a startup is focusing on problems that are not answered. Customer groups that are not served. So you're not coming from the central, and if you move into the central, you have to be big enough and people party kind of like enough, and then you lose your startup, sex appeal or something. So that might be a built-in contradiction of the logic, and it's probably a task or an obstacle you guys all have to confront in these years.
Can I? Because it's a really interesting point. Just quickly, it's a really good and interesting point, and I think wrong, because there are two ways to do transformative change, and one I think you referred to, and I think it's right. Of course, you can come from the extreme, so to say, and by definition, I agree with that. By definition, the center cannot be extreme, but there's a great concept, particularly, I think it comes from the Anglosphere, and that is the radical center. And that's not about the extremes, but it's about a center that really tries to approach systems change comprehensively. And I think that's not a contradiction. I think that's actually, you can be a centrist and you can be a radical. We are not used to this kind of marriage of those two terms, also not in Austria and also not in Germany, but it's possible. And I think the center needs to be much more radical without becoming extreme. And we saw that the 2015 crisis really changed the game, so that suddenly political startups, centrist political startups, are now guardians of old systems, like of liberal democracy, of the constitution. But again, that is not a contradiction to try to protect liberal democracy, but radically change the way the state works.
Just because, I think you're right. And I just want to give an example which is well known by everyone. Google was a startup, Facebook was a startup, and they grew enormously big. And they were able to capture a lot of radical features of their organizational design, even by being the world's largest company. So that's probably the largest challenge. I'm not sure it's like fully applicable to the political scene, and there are a lot of differences. But yes, it is doable. But many startups will fail on that. That part I still think is a danger.
I would just add only one thing. From our point of view, what we mean on centrist is because we wanted to overcome the old left and right division. And this is why it's centrist. not necessarily by ideology. We just said that in a 21st century, if you want to facing global issues, global problems, and actually the frustration of the society, who is between right and left, and get completely fed up with both sizes, you have to be centric. Centric in a sense to bring in a new mentality, bring in new political tools, issues, and focusing on solutions instead of old school ideological terms. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter which issue you bring in, you can describe in different ideologies and the result is the same. I'll give you an example. For instance, the first time we went to the Budapest Pride, everybody said, oh yes, so you are supporting gay marriage and so you can be only just a liberal new party. There's nothing new under the sun. You are not a centrist. You don't want to include everybody from left to right. And even our members, a couple of members said the same. And then we said, listen, I thought we all agreed that what we really believe is the equality in law, that all the civilians or all the people has to be equal in front of the law. Yeah, we all agree in that. Well, we want that marriage will be available for everybody. And they say, oh yeah, actually that's true. So in that sense, it's not only purely a liberal issue to support gay marriage. And then when we started to talk about the value of families, they also all agreed, the most conservative members agreed, and then they realized, oh yeah, from this angle, we should also support gay marriage. So I think this is what we can also meant on being centrist. Is not necessarily mean that you always be in the middle. It means that we don't want to act on issues based on old school right and left ideologies and old school way of doing politics.
Thank you, Csaba.
When I thought what role I would play at this discussion, I gave a lot of thought to it, and then I said, I'll play the political science view. And you know, political scientists, even liberal political scientists, are sometimes conservative about political change. So I'll start by the skeptic position, and then I'll go on to arguing, because Josef knows that being a skeptic about this has nothing to do with the relevance of it. But I'll just start by saying, you know, if you look at party system development, the first point you make is always, well, we've seen this before, right? Is this really a thing? I think that's the first question you ask. Are these really new parties, or have we seen this all before? I'm sure some of you are familiar with some of these arguments. When Obama was there in 2008 and started saying, hope, let's bring hope to Washington, let's destroy the system. And some people found out that these were exact quotes from Kennedy, 1960. They said very similar things about changing the whole political system. And you see this every 5 or 10 years, people coming and wanting to change the political system. So I think the first question you ask is this a real thing? When I teach political science and party political system, 5 or 10 years ago, I always told my students, you know, if you have done no preparation for the exam, just say, well, in this country, there's one big social democratic party, one big Christian democratic party, and a very small party that's either liberal or green. You cannot really go wrong. You will be right. But if we look at the political scene today in Europe, that's no longer the case, which is in itself a case for the relevance of this, that something really is happening. In Spain, you have a 4-party system now. In Italy, you have two parties in government, none of which have come from the traditional families. In Poland, you have a party like this. So I think the first argument there, if you ask the question, so is this really a real thing? It is a real thing. It's bigger than the changes we've seen before. And I think that already is a very important argument why we should discuss these issues. Now, some of these are startups, some of these are different political entities, and I haven't mentioned En Marche yet, which is obviously the biggest impact. So then the question becomes, okay, so then what is a political startup? How can we define this? And Josef gave a definition, and then Jörg gave a definition of startups in the business sphere. And of course, there are many differences. Each person has 1 vote. You can't have 2 votes. You can bring in new people. You can bring some new people in, but already most people are there. You can sort of increase the market in a way. You can't really introduce new services. So there are a lot of differences there. But I think what we can interpret here from the business example as well is to have, which is what you mentioned, to have a political movement which manages to sort of become very big, very fast, and then somehow stabilizes that and can do that with the help, not just, I think, of technology, but by the new and more modern phenomenon in which you can which you can reach voters more easily. You can reach voters whose stability to traditional parties is smaller than it used to be. You can build up someone very fast, and I think the challenge usually is how once you have like this big success like Momentum had with Olympia, how you can stay there. Just to give you one example, in Poland, there was Wiosna, which is a new leftist party. Some of you have read about it. It was, I think, 15% 3 months ago. Now it's polling at 6%. It was a big bubble. We don't know if it's going to stay there. So I think the challenge is very often staying there. And frankly, I think in Hungary, the first political startup was probably LMP. Politics can be different. That was in many ways a political startup, and we've seen their evolution. So my real question is, I don't have a solution for that, is I think we sort of see how you can sort of create a bubble of interest around a political organization based on technology. I think the question is how you can sustain that interest, especially in circumstances where that interest, because of the very reasons that have created it, because of technological change, because of people not paying attention, as long attention span being smaller, how you can sustain that change on the long run. And I think that's a challenge certainly for Momentum. That's a challenge for many parties.
Thank you very much. Shaba already mentioned the know-hows, and Anna already said that actually the book is not just about startups, but for startups. So my second question would be, and also actually the book is structured as a roadmap. So there's also an appendix. So it's practically, it can be used also as a toolkit for political entrepreneurs. So my second question would be, is there a general recipe for startups? And do actually local differences, ideological differences matter? You already said that there are populist startups, right-wing startups. So is there a general recipe or not, or should we actually consider the local differences?
Of course, local differences. Differences between countries matter a lot for the outlook and the success. I mean, the political markets are structured very differently. Now, if you have the success of En Marche, for example, it wouldn't be replicable as such in Austria or in Hungary, just because the system is different, that you have this presidential figure, and then you have these parliamentary elections coming after. So all the hype that Macron brought into office and brought En Marche to power, it is basically closer to a first-past-the-post system. But even in those systems, if you look at the UK, for example, where you now have the independent group, even in those systems where people said it's impossible to establish a new party there, it's actually happening right now. And again, we'll see whether they are sustainable or whether they will be dissolved in the next months. But even those systems who were thought to be immune to political innovation, we now see changes happening. And perhaps even in the US, I wouldn't say that it's impossible that potentially, for example, the Republicans may implode, or even also the Democrats may implode at some point. Certainly the Tories and or Labour may implode quite soon, potentially. So that's the thing, right? We're living in interesting times, but yes, differences in terms of the electoral system, differences in terms of party financing, they certainly matter and need to be taken into account when we try to understand political startups. Of course, I've taken quite a narrow sample. I've taken liberal centrist startups, and as we already discussed, there are many more on the left, on the right, on the fringes that are also very successful. So there's a lot to be learned from them, particularly as you mentioned, for example, from Cinque Stelle and how they started their blog. There's a great story, if you want to read it, on Casaleggio, the guy you talked about, in The Atlantic. It's quite a recent article on, was it Wired? Anyway, you can look it up on the Wired. Yeah. It's a great article and gives you an understanding of how they did it.
Would you?
Well, I believe that each startup wants to become a successful company at the end. So it's a stage, and it can't be forever. And I think it's important to know that we can't operate forever as a startup. And after a while, if we are successful, we want to become one of the new traditional parties. Of course, we're going to be things differently, because that's the whole idea, because the world going to be different. Who knows, in 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years, we're going to reach that level. But the world definitely going to be different. A year ago, everything was different. And I wouldn't be afraid to say that there's going to be new startups coming up later on. That's how it should be. It's not like, okay, we are now the startup in Hungary, political startup, and then that's have to be for good like this in a history book. So I believe that that we have to focus on the advantages right now to be a startup, but we have to already, as Josef said at the beginning, prepare what's going to happen after, because I think it's like we know who's doing it every day by day. That at the end of the day, if we are not prepared for what's going to happen in not just tomorrow or in a year or at the end of the upcoming elections, but if we don't have a vision and a plan for the next 10 years, we're going to die out. Because first of all, there's the nature of politics, that the other party is going to eat us up alive. It's already trying to do it. So I think the only reason why they can't is because they don't understand the logic of a political startup. They attacking us with all the tools and methods they learned in the past years doing politics, but towards a group of people who never been involved in politics and has nothing to do with their methods. So we can use these advantages until we reach a certain point, but then when we are in the big league, there are rules of the big leagues, of course. Like every political startup, Momentum also wants to change the rules of the big league. But nobody knows whether we're going to be the startup turned to be the successful company who can be a game changer. That's our plan, and we are prepared to do so. Let's hope.
George, is there a general recipe?
Nope. Actually, that's the growth part and the how you grow and what different challenges you face. That's my favorite part, probably, of the book, and that's the part which is closest to the business startup challenges, and that's the answer to you as well. If there is one very important thing why a startup can be successful during those years, it is that they are able to manage the challenges that arose from the extreme growth of the organization, of the customer base, of the technology and everything. Imagine that Facebook is not 20 years old. Uber is not 10 years old. Within a few years, these companies grow from 5 to thousands of people or 10,000s of people. And those guys, and if no one else, Mark Zuckerberg's personal journey is the greatest example. I mean, the guy from the dormitory of the university, literally within years, was lifted or elevated to the G8 summit. I never forget that image when he was actually talking to Putin and all the other guys. And that was a guy in his 30s with no education, no help whatsoever in that field. So growth is a very important part, and that's if I'm an investor, if I were to be an investor of a political startup, I would try to test the guys. Will they be able to manage that growth? Will they be able to run the organization? Do they practical enough to run a much larger organization? Going back to the question, business startups does not have a general recipe. There are common features. One of which might be relevant here is that they always have to have a competitive knowledge. They usually, I mean, the best startups go for a blue ocean. They go for a market which does not exist. They create a new market. This is something what you refer to, that instead of traditional, political basis, they kind of like recreate the customer base, the political base, around new narratives. And that might work, but in every country, the competitive landscape is totally different. And here, my role probably ends, because if we see a startup that tries to be active in a heavily regulated market, we run away. And politics, by definition, is probably the most regulated markets of all. So there's a lot of problem with our approach. But nevertheless, if you start a startup in any country, you have to have a deep understanding of the competitive landscape. Just freshness, just the attitude, just the energy doesn't bring you to the top. You have to be very truth-loving, so to speak, in that respect.
I really liked that Josef in his presentation, and also the book, starts by, and this resonates with what you said, understanding. And startups are very new, but in politics there's a very old saying in which says politics is the art of the possible. And that basically means that most times politics just does what has been going on for a very long time. If you ask any political scientist to make a prediction of what's going to happen or what the political landscape is going to look like in the next half a year, the safest bet is always to say it's going to be looking like what it looks like now. That's always the safest, statistically speaking. 9 times out of 10, what's normal is going to happen again. And 9 times out of 10, something that's deemed impossible is not going to happen. But there is that one time in which it's different. And I think one of the key elements of finding a new political startup is understanding when that chance arises, to try to separate what really is impossible from what's only just really, really hard to do, but possible to do. I think that's a very important distinction to make. Some things in politics, and that's what the saying "politics is the art of the possible" refers to. There are many things you can do. Most people don't necessarily try. Very often, political startups like Momentum will hear, "Well, what you want to do is impossible." But it's really important to see when to run away from a conflict. I think what you mentioned, that's also part of understanding, and when to go for it, when to have that one opportunity in which is that 1 out of 10, which it's actually possible, only, quote unquote, very, very difficult, because then you will have your moment, and try to understand that once you had that moment, it doesn't mean you will always have that moment. You will have it once or twice again, but not every time. You cannot have your expectations to repeat your first success over and over again. That is not necessarily something that will happen.
Let me just add two elements of the general recipe, which doesn't exist. But every startup has to be super conscious on the resources and the financing. And this is the holy cow of political startups, because transparency, regulation, and a lot of issues there. But if you don't have the resources to build that company, to invest into the early stages before your success, to maintain speed of development, then you're dead. And that's probably true in politics as well. And it's usually underplayed because of the very special environment around political startups, which is the media. If you just say a word, this is the example you gave of the water privatization. So if you have a label wrong, you're attacked viciously. Business startups do not have that uncomfort. But still, within your party ranks, within the party headquarters, someone has to have a clear idea about the financing of the story. And if the answer is not proven there, you don't, startups usually, I have an idea, I don't know how to get there, but I believe in myself. That's fine. But if you don't have an idea of the different steps of financing, which is in business startups, venture capital, that is my profession, then don't start it, please, because then you just sell, a fake hope. So probably financing is one big area, and the other one is, which is in common between business and political startup, is the talent management part and HR. there is a saying in venture capital that we invest into teams and not into ideas, because the idea plays only like, you know, a smaller role in the overall success, 10% or so. But the real definitive issue is the ability of that team to work together, to grow, to import, you know, new other guys, and things like that. And in this respect, I see political startups as nothing different. They have to be, again, very conscious on team building, HR, people management. It requires a very special talent here. You have to, like, you're being grilled all the time in the media. You give up a lot on your public, on your private life. So you have to be conscious. And in your book, there's one story. It's probably the, I can't recall which one. But the guy was actually the Spanish one. They started the organization, basically two guys alone, and they entered the national scene. And this guy alone drove thousands and thousands of miles all around Spain to public event like this and see the people who were active and then approach them and basically headhunting the first, you know, few dozens of the party. That's very business-like. That's very startup-like. That's very professional, and I think that's something which can be important.
I really like the point about political as the art of the possible, and referring to, again, kind of what parallels are there. So political startups, from my perspective, keep pushing what is possible, and even sometimes achieve things that are thought to be impossible by innovating. And that's, I think, again, a parallel. So, for example, one thing we innovated with NEOS was we needed money. And so we knew the figure 2 million euros. How do you get to there? So we started, and this was revolutionary for back then in 2012-13, we started crowdfunding with citizens, 50 euros, 100 euros, but sometimes also 1,000 or 5,000 euros. And we invented basically a new financial instrument for party financing, which was a risk-carrying loan. So it was basically a bet. The bet was such that you gave the party a loan, 5,000 euros, and the party would pay you back if it got into parliament. If it didn't get into parliament, it would become a donation. So basically, you lost your money, but if it was successful, you got it back. Of course, people only give you the money if they think you have a fair chance of actually getting into parliament. But we actually did that also on state level then, and it was and it's still quite a successful instrument for raising medium-sized donations, not the real big ones, but 5,000, 10,000 people, sometimes give you that if they believe in you. And that such kind of it's a small innovation, but it's something that nobody had thought about before that, and it helped us actually be successful.
Yeah, actually, I also wanted to just react because what Csaba and György said, there's some contradiction in it. Because if we would listen to such a smart suggestions before, Momentum would be nowhere, on a sense that you have to know your finances, you have to plan it in advance, you have to have already some basis. Well, we work like Csaba explained. We believe that there's no impossible. Without any money, we started an Olympia campaign, and at the end, it was, I think, 12 million forint, the whole budget, which was crowdfunded. I know this is super crazy, and it couldn't work forever. It could work for that project, and it can work for several projects, but we can't run on a crowdfunded base without money. However, we're still trying to do it. So far we survived and we are growing. However, it won't be possible in a long run. But if you always plan everything, sometimes you just miss the opportunity. However, you also have to take into account that as a general advice and a general explanation of how startups and political startup works, it's perfect, but you always have to take into account in which country and which situation it's happening. Right now, for instance, we are in this vicious circle that more and more people see the fantasy and alternative in Momentum and said, yes, I would really like to give donations for this good cause. But first, I want to see that other people are doing the same. Secondly, I want to see that you reaching some political success, like getting to the European Parliament or having some seats in the local municipalities. And then you start to think like, yeah, but in order to do a campaign, you need money. So where to start this whole thing? And this is why I just want to highlight one really important thing, and which is the power of Momentum. And I think the power behind all these progressive centrist movements is human resources. The knowledge pool we have has such a value that other parties pays big money to have that knowledge and the infrastructure behind. I'm talking from the simplest things like building up web pages, which some our volunteers put together, for instance, the Olympia webpage or now the Budapest program webpage within one night. And professional web pages that otherwise you have to pay millions of forints. But also there's another thing which I know that now has it, and we kind of take as a best practice to Hungary, your academy. We have also Momentum Academy, which builds on, as we can't pay money for our volunteers, the members who are working to build up the organization and make it run everyday basis. We give them knowledge, we share knowledge among each other. We are full of PhD doctors, we are full of people who has their own startups and companies, successful teachers, and so on and so forth. We're teaching each other, we're sharing knowledge. This is how we pay for each other, and this is what we also offer locally for people who are sympathizing with the movement. Because we believe that sharing knowledge is how you build up a community, which is even more valuable at one point than money. Because when you said your goal was 2 million euro, this is something crazily unbelievable from a Momentum perspective right now, which we are super happy at the end of the month if we have 2 million forint on our bank account. So if you don't have money, you need creativity and you need to find that knowledge pool, and you need to use human resources. So I think from a political startup, that's the most important factor of it.
I'm happy that you talk about the crowdfunding and even one of the people, because there's a chapter in the book of Josef where it's about the crisis of liberal democracy. And when we think about startups, we think about crowdfunding because startups don't have that organization as a resource, so they should rely on people. And this is how we think about democracy as well, right? Participation, involvement of the people. So when it comes to the crises, startups are not just challenges, but is there a possibility that this kind of involvement could be revive democracy or not? So what should actually startuppers, political startuppers or business startuppers consider when it comes to involvement?
Very, very good point. So there's a quote I very much like from Buckminster Fuller, and it says, if you want to change existing reality, don't fight it, but build a better one, a new one that makes the old one obsolete. So what this says is, and of course you need to fight as a political startup, but what you need to do is you need to build a model in miniature, so to say, ideally of democracy as it can and should work. So yes, if you're serious about transforming the system, you first need to transform yourself. This is, and I think you're both absolutely right, that human resources are crucial, that you need that you need empathy. In order to have empathy, you need to have a high level of self-reflection in order to build that system of the different kind of party that is more participatory. For example, with NEOS, when we started, it was a few people who said, let's get a group of people together. And let's work for 2 days and see, what comes out of it in terms of, potential policies and manifesto and so on. And I thought, we should be 15 people or so. 15 people would be a good group size, not too large. And actually, when we then announced that we want to do this, 40 people said they want to take part. And I said, 40 people, that's crazy. We cannot work with 40 people. Somebody will leak to the press. Not that anyone would have cared, at this point in time. But we cannot accommodate them. And Matthias, who then later became chairman, said, and I also have it in the book, the story, he said, if we have 40 people interested, let's work with 40 people. And he was right. We needed to be able to accommodate, large groups of interested citizens with, formats like open space, like world cafes, formats that are not normally used in politics, to enable them to participate as citizens in this creation of this new party. And we grew from 40 to 150 to 250 to 500, and this is how NEOS actually came into existence. So yes, I fully agree. Political startups, if they're serious about systems transformation, that they need to show that, they need to walk the talk by themselves.
Just one reflection to the early stage. I mean, in the startup life cycle, there's the very early stage, which is called the valley of death. When you don't have that's the catch-22 part, what you referred to. When you don't have the financing, you are not known. So you have to have some kind of financing in order to survive until you get the first professional financing. And that's the valley of death, when you're a loss maker. And usually people finance it from, it's called bootstrapping. So friends, family, fools, believers, that's the small part. But since startups grow very, very fast and aggressively, so especially successful ones, in a very early stage, you reach the point when your next two classes will require an enormous amount of money and organization. So you cannot live in the heroic early phase of your startup when you were able to actually finance it from your pure energy and love and devotion, but you have to professionalize in that sense. So that's probably the learning of business startups here as well. On another note, I mean, to me, the whole, I'm not playing a role in politics. I'm just reading newspapers. It's not really beneficial for my health these days. But the most interesting part of this whole thing, the renewal of the political scene, startups and everything, is that obviously there's an institutional crisis in every developed democratic country in the world, regardless of the cultural heritage. Yes, the old guards are dying. They are irrelevant. They don't have a powerful narrative to defend. While from every angles, there are new narratives emerging. Right now, it was the populist in the last few years that took us surprise. There's probably be a counter surge of that, but it's still about what will replace liberal democracies as we know them, and that's the most interesting part to me, because being a tech investor, I see technology as a powerful force behind this whole thing. First, technology changed media. I mean, I was a journalist. I started Origo. I started IVIV. And we were all about idealism. We will set up online a New York Times, and that will be the end of, Fukuyama kind of. That will be the end of, democracy and development. And then now Origo is a monster of the journalistic standards. Facebook is under attack because it destroyed the political discourse and opened up a lot of windows, and behind those windows, not only bright, it's not only a bright future, but a technological dystopia is seen. So again, the most interesting part: how is democracy will change in this, and technology is playing a big role of it. First, it was captured by its founders. So 4 years ago, 3 years ago, I was giving lectures about, how Google, Amazon, Facebook, and the others are actually controlling the world's data. They're controlling the resources of the future without no, limitation and control. And then in the last few years, it shifted, and because all the power license was actually tied to the nationalist state, the nation state, and the political parties, the political sphere took over that control over the data. That's when Cambridge Analytica, that's the Trump story and everything. And the real issue is, how will society, how will us, how will the civil society will gain back control over the resources of over technology and over the resources of the 21st century. And in my view, it is by far not obvious that it will gain control. And that's the issue, and that's why this is where I refer to your idea that from a political startup, as an investor, I would like to see the vision, how they envision the democratic process. The Estonians started something with the e-voting. That's a good example. Cinque Stelle, your story. Within the movement, you start experimenting with direct democracy and tech-based democracy. These are the most important ideas, not just the old guard versus new guard, you know, fresh young guys versus tired old guys.
Thank you very much, George. After Csaba's and Anna's reflection, we are going to open the floor for the question. Anna, please.
I would only add one thing, because at one hand, we always said that these new political startups are the ones who really understand the 21st century, which also means knows what and how to use these new technological things and creatures. On the other hand, I also believe that we are not just the young and fresh who want to overcome the old, but as we said at the beginning, political startups wants to bring something new and recalling something that nobody could recall before, which also means that we have to bring in new voters. In the case of Momentum, we wanted to bring in youngsters because we felt ourselves not represented in the parliament. Secondly, those ones who are so much in deep political apathy that nobody else can ever recall them. We need to give them something different in order to bring them into politics, because we believe that that's the only way that at one point we can change the system. We can stop the ruling of Fidesz. Therefore, it's really nice that we know the new technological tools and we have actually solutions for the future. We have a 365 pages long program how we could use technological tools like e-democracy in Hungary. However, in order to do that, as Josef said, we have to walk the talk. So therefore, on an everyday basis, what we do is completely offline, and the most old schoolest tools that you can ever imagine, which the older parties tend to be forgetting. What is it? To go door to door, to hold forums on the street, not in a paid bar rooms in a hotel. And instead of just telling people how we want to change Hungary, actually asking questions from people, start a conversation, including them into finding solution locally, creating local communities, and that in the end, this is what we also agree, that if we really believe that everything can be different and we need a different mentality, it also means that you have to bring politics back closer to the people, you have to include them, which needs politicians who has human face, can be reachable, one of the crowd and not a far elite, because this is what the populists could act on very well, that politicians are far elite, like how Orban calling Brussels something far untouchable and dangerous. Why? What is a politician? Politician is actually somebody who doesn't afraid to put her face or his face out there in order to do politics, which actually all of us doing, because what's doing politics is basically think, talk, and act on public issues. So this is what we want to bring back into the discourse, but not just in a sphere like this, but in even more simpler spheres like a town hall or in a square. Everybody do politics, and politics is not dangerous, is not something from the evil. Actually, politics can be sexy. So we can enjoy talking and doing politics. And this is the new thing we want to bring in. But for that, right now, at least in Hungary, you have to be completely offline.
Thank you very much, Anna. So we now open the floor for the questions. I'd like to ask if there are questions there. Yes, please.
Hello. Thank you very much. It was all really interesting. I did two political startups in my life, very different, under very different conditions. And one of my questions, which you covered, but I would be interested in how you see the dynamic of when you start a startup. How far is it something which is planned and designed and follow a certain strategy, or how far it's an intuition, risk-taking, learning by doing? I think you spoke two different approach, but it might not be so different. So I would be interested in the dynamics. And the other question of mine would be of how important leadership is, or what does this mean, leadership, in terms of, we speak a lot about political leadership, and charismatic leaders are the zeitgeist, but is this really the case?
Any other questions? There's not yet.
So the predication of the discussion has been the parallel between business startup and political startup. In the United Kingdom at the moment, the new kid on the block, our own political startup, the Independent Group, is actually not exhibiting a parallel but a confluence of those things, because its legal form is as a limited company, not as a political party, and that gives it a flexibility at the moment that allows it to be very manoeuvrable in terms of the regulatory environment that you referred to. I just wondered whether anyone on the panel thought that that was likely to be a pattern with startups across Europe, or whether that's something very specific to the context of the United Kingdom at the moment.
I'll start with the last question. Thank you very much. I think it's very, very dependent on the political system in the UK. You cannot, in the UK, for first past the post reasons, it's very, very hard, as you know, to really start something from scratch. So this is why, I mean, there were startups in the past, right? The Social Democrats, and we basically only can establish something by splitting off, at least so far. And this is what happened here, and this is why they used an LLC. I don't think that's replicable in any other system, really, because it would be very irritating if somebody would operate as an LLC in the political system, I think, in other political environments. To your point, I was an entrepreneur before I went into politics, and I'm an entrepreneur again. And to me, entrepreneurs take calculated risks. So they're not, they don't jump off the cliff and wait for something to happen. They know that there's a certain amount of risk involved. I don't know, 50-50 that it works out. But you are normally aware that, there's a certain amount of risk and what that risk means. And that, for example, if you found something new, you might get sanctioned. You might lose mandates and clients because the system starts, its immune reaction. So all of that, if you don't think of that beforehand, you're probably going to be dead pretty soon, because you need to have some kind of response to that, and you need to be resilient about that, I think. And regarding leadership, I think it's super important. Again, if you want to be transformative, if you want to have a different politics on the macro level, you need to practice it on the micro level. You cannot be an authoritarian in your own party and try to preach a new democracy. In the 21st century, it doesn't work like that. A word will get out, like with, I don't know, Amy Klobuchar in the US presidential elections campaign right now. You need to be human, and you need to be a good, responsive, empathic leader, I think. So yes, leadership is absolutely crucial.
George, please.
Yeah, just the parallels between the business and the political part again. The leadership, yes. I mean, startups are dominated by by their founders, and the founders' role is very crucial because most of the startups now are still led by by their founders. There are a few examples. The Uber guy was quitting. The Google founders were actually importing someone from the established industry, learned the job, and then took it back. Bill Gates was running his company for decades. So yes, usually the founder's role is important. It's a very interesting area of research here. How does that apply to the political party? How does that apply to the democratic process? Because one of the founders, one of the startups you referred to, it was actually founded by the guy who still runs the party. That was the party we've been participating together 30 years ago here in Hungary, and it's still the same guy. That's not very good for business usually, but it's doable. It's rarely doable in a democratic process, but still, we don't know. But the role of the founder in the first, 5 years, it is very important. Founders, because we always invest into teams. So again, a guy who is in the media, the guy who's running the organization, probably at least, a minimum requirement. The other question is about the methodology. I don't really want to get into it because it's like a long, long story. Just to raise one point, startups ruling practice now is the lean development, which is do, measure, pivot, start again. So learn from your customers. In politics, that kind of pragmatism might interfere with, a principle-based political standpoint. You have to stand for something. You cannot actually always, changing your policy according to what people want to hear. So a certain mix of, pragmatism and stickiness to the principles has to be here. And the third element is failure. Startups love failure. Fail fast. That's the saying. I'm not sure whether in politics you can afford that. That you fail 4 times and you still have a 5th chance. But I don't know.
I love this example. I always, when I went to some of these startup events, they always say, "Well, you should fail and then try again." Well, Ferenc Gyurcsány failed in 2006. He's still that one failure is still has an impact, and you saw it that no matter what you try, that one big failure is still a problem. So that's obviously a difference. I just want to say 2 things. First of all, not specifically at the UK example, but there are many types of, I would say, new political parties. Sometimes they do come from old ones. I mean, Macron made a wonderful job of making people forget that he was a minister of the Socialist Party under the previous president. And he still looked at, rightly so, I think, as an innovator. And that is not specifically your question, but I think it's important that it's not necessarily the position or your personal story. It's a new way of thinking, and that leads me to the leadership question, where I think we all agree that it's important. But why it's important, I think, is that in this day and age, politics and choosing between political forces is often choosing between programs and ideas, and of course you never entirely know the specific and the details of the political program you support. But because of a lot of things, we now tend to project our vision to people about those political programs. Macron himself, and I think he's a good example, he represents, I mean, you look at him, you listen to the way he talks, he represents sort of a liberal, free market, young, dynamic, entrepreneurial, pro-European thing. That's what he represents. You don't necessarily need a program to read. You project some of these into him. And then, of course, he plays on that and brands himself as such. But leadership, I think, is also important because people have, and it's a cliche, but it's true, people and leaders have become more important in many ways and have replaced programs and platforms in many ways. So you need to project something as a leader, and of course the other part I think is, which we haven't discussed, is you also need actual leadership. So in order to, a startup is of course a product, a startup is something that you need to sell, but as you mentioned very often, I think rightly so, it's an organization. You also need to run it, or you need to have people who help you in running it. And I don't really know many examples in which say, okay, so this one leader, he doesn't have to be able to do this because others will have, he will have advisors doing that. I don't think that works very often. I think real leadership needs to combine many of these abilities. That is what political leadership is about.
Just to give you an example of the valuation of the founders, I'm sorry, just an example which brings it closer. Elon Musk can actually, I mean, startups, it's not the actually money that they produce, it's the valuation of the company, which is very similar to politics. How you perceived. And if Elon Musk sell you an idea right at day one, it's like millions and 10 millions of dollars because he's the one who sells it. And that's probably absolutely similar in politics if you think that Macron is the thing you're waiting for.
I just wanted to add one thing for leadership, because I think that's the trickiest thing when you run a political startup. That, of course, you can learn a lot about how in business world or in political scene, how other parties or social, civil society organization works. It's completely useless in a case of a startup. I believe, at least in our case, the most important in our leadership skill is the capability of empowering people, which actually you need a lot of social skills to do it. So way much more than when you are running a company or when you are running a completely built-up organization. However, just having that skill itself is not enough again. So I don't know what is the recipe. Of course, I'm in the middle of that, and we are learning by doing right now. And actually, we are really afraid, because I think in a case of a startup, even sometimes a small failure can be the end of the game. Or sometimes you can just fail as much as 5 years old and learn from that mistakes, because nobody cares, and a lot of people are forgetting you because you are just started to doing so. However, I really believe that when we're talking about leadership skills, you have to go further than just whether you would be a good CEO in a company. You have to be a good teacher, you have to be a good sister, you have to be a good friend, and so on and so forth. And actually, this is why, for me, this book gives a lot of answers back, because in order to be able to do it so, it's not enough that you have those skills. You need your surroundings, you need partner in crimes around, you need a really supportive family, believe me, really supportive friends, because actually it's a full-time job. It's like raising a kid, like running a political startup.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. I think it's a very interesting topic. Before we would go, I'd like to ask Josef to give some practical information for those who want to purchase the book, and so others can learn about these very interesting issues which are covered by the book.
Thanks, very kind. So I've got a couple of books here, so it's really just two. You can buy it from me. Other than that, you can, of course, order it on Amazon or from Springer direct. Unfortunately, it costs a bit. That was my decision, so please forgive me. But it's 35 euros. So if you're interested, I'm happy to sign it as well, of course. No, from me, thank you very much for having me today, and thanks as well. It was a very interesting and pleasurable discussion, and I learned a lot from you, and I'm happy to hear that the book is interesting. So just one last word from me. My ambition with the book is not just to have some pages, but to also build something out of it. And so referring to the valley of death, I think that's something that a lot of political startups have experienced, dying on the way to glory. So this is why I'm actually in the moment in the process of building an incubator out of this roadmap, because as you said, you know, for business startups there is support, there is venture capital, there are incubators, there are accelerators, there's a whole ecosystem of support around high growth business startups. There's not something like that for political startups. So this is my ambition to take it to the next stage and build some real institution out of it. So thank you very much. Thanks again, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Josef. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, George, for coming. I'd just like to ask you to take a moment and fill out the forms which are on the table. Thank you very much. And now the roundtable discussion is closed.
Yes, sure.